Mhm. And you mentioned earlier that you studied prairie voles, and I don't think everyone knows this, but I think there's probably a good general sense out there that obviously not all animals are monogamous. There's a range of sort of promiscuity with which animals display sexual interactions with conspecifics, with members of their same species. Some are very promiscuous and they sort of mate, and there's no real attachment that forms between the male and the female beyond that. And then, humans and prairie voles, I think, would be, sort of one extreme where we're much more monogamous than the majority of other species. What was that number that you cited for how frequent monogamy is in the animal kingdom?
So that's actually, those are, I mean, the earliest estimates were from a researcher named Deborah Kleinman, who in the late 70s basically estimated about 3 to 5% of mammals.
Mammals.
But even within mammals, right, there's a huge diversity. So as you mentioned, with primates, there's a slightly higher than average, than sort of across mammals, average of monogamous mating systems. But if we go, for example, to canids, right, there's actually like, I think probably now 3 or 4 year old sort of study/review, where in the wild, with the exception of domesticated dogs, you do not see canid species that don't display some form of social monogamy, sort of independent of their complex social structure. If we go to like songbirds, outside of mammals, 90% of songbirds are monogamous. And so there's huge variability in terms of both just sort of the patterns of mating systems, and then also the sort of the likelihood that a species is going to actually display those types of behaviors.
Mm-hmm. And when we say monogamy, I'm curious to have you define what exactly that means in two respects. So one, when we're talking about sexual behavior, does monogamy mean lifelong pair bonding? Does it mean for a season or like some quote unquote long period of time? And then does this only refer to sexual behavior? Or can we talk about social monogamy in a more general way?
So I think maybe for the purpose of the conversation, I would sort of veer into the realm of social monogamy, right? Because in most systems, you see that if you really look at the patterns of behavior, you see sort of what we'd say extra pair matings, right? And they happen with different frequencies in different contexts. They're actually influenced by different environmental contexts. And so in general, we're talking about sort of the social monogamy that's displayed by a mating pair. And as you sort of alluded to, there are certain species where it's lifelong, and then there are other species where it's basically a reproductive cycle, and that varies. Again, the frequency and the sort of the styles sort of vary across different subsets of species. Presumably based off of sort of the evolutionary pressures that it's evolved in.
Yeah, I mean that's actually an interesting question. Is do we know anything about what some of those evolutionary drivers are? Like, why would some species want to be monogamous and not others?
Sure. So I mean, that's a great question. And I think it's maybe useful to kind of divide it, at least when we think about mammals, sort of rodents, or was I going to say primates, and sort of what we call below primates, and then primates and above. And, canids and dogs, they're maybe a separate entity. For most species, the largest driving force seems to be sort of female distribution as a consequence of resource scarcity. So if you take sort of I think the most recent estimates are, at least in mammals, maybe about 60 times that monogamy has evolved. And if you look at that pattern, you seem to have a species that gets distributed over a large territory where resources aren't necessarily abundant, either seasonally or, sort of just geographically. So then, if you're talking about a promiscuous species, the females are sort of left with, raising their young and then having to sort of defend against intruders, defending against, predators, things like that. And so in that context, there is sort of this evolutionary question that, is influenced by the female, certainly in terms of her wanting to keep a male around, but then the male deciding, is it better for me to risk my offspring with this female being killed or dying versus defending them and co-parenting? Because that's also a really important feature that's sort of co-evolved, is that in almost every of these mammalian species, you see very strong co-parenting behavior, even though they are independent. And so that sort of evolutionary toss-up seems to be one of the major motivating factors for most mammals, that, it's in the male's best interest genetically, as well as, sort of resource provision wise, to defend his offspring and his mate against, other potential mates. And
I see. So if we think about this in terms of like David Attenborough nature documentaries, you see something like, the mother bear, and she raises the cubs by herself. And she's, I guess basically what you're saying is the reason for that is the bears, as one example, live in environments where the mother is able to get more or less everything she needs, food wise, etc., for the cubs, and there's really no need for having that second parent there. But other species, I guess humans would be an example. If we live in more difficult environments where food is more scarce, you need to have, both parents either partitioning what they're doing to help rear the young, and have one or both of them being sort of the ones going out into this sort of more sparse environment and bringing things back so that you have everything you need for the offspring.
Yeah. So, and I think that actually may be part of why there's this distinction between sort of primates and below and primates above, is that with primates that are like altricial, right? The young are so helpless when they're born. You really need a lot of resources to provide for them for their survival. There's also another interesting sort of potential correlate, which is that in many sort of primate species, or even, if we again go back to the canids, you also have multi-generational sort of sets of animals living together. And so there's a much more complicated, in some cases, I don't want to say that this is something that defines the rule. So there's a lot more complex social interactions that are mediating sort of who is mating with whom, who can mate with whom, but more importantly, who lives with whom and who protects and shares resources. And so you get a much more complex structure where there is, at least modeling wise, a benefit to sort of having a single mating unit that then sort of creates an intergenerational sort of kinship or family unit. And then depending upon how animals leave that eventually, that sort of helps facilitate them forming their own clan, one, with its own numbers and its own sort of ability to provide. And again, there's a little bit of a debate between how that really influences and whether that's, cause or consequence. And I should also just add that, another factor that comes in, at least to the models for primates, is this idea of infanticide, right? That, where you, and certain people sort of have data that support it. Other, there's contention that where you have species that may also demonstrate infanticide as a consequence potentially of either genetics or resource scarcity, that actually then also facilitates that even more the need for sort of biparental care to protect the offspring and sort of,
I see. So, I mean, again, using the David Attenborough method of coming up with examples here, I've seen many nature documentaries where you have a pride of lions. Right, there's sort of the dominant male, and he effectively has a harem of females. Eventually, he gets old and feeble enough, and a younger male will come and sort of take over the pride. And one of the dark aspects for that species is very often my understanding is that the new male will basically murder all of the infants.
Right. And interestingly, in cats, there isn't actually a high incidence of monogamy. So those are some of the data that maybe call into question sort of the primary role of this like sort of infanticidal drive. And I think it's a question up for debate. It's also, it's a phylogenetic question that I think only more and more data really can sort of help us model better.
Yeah. Is the extent to which a species is monogamous also influencing the extent to which they are sexually dimorphic, generally speaking? Because I can imagine that if you have, let's say humans, for example, and other primates, a truly helpless young baby that needs constant care, you really have to have at least one parent who's always going to be there. And then because they always need to be there, they might have different sort of attachment styles, different modes of defensive aggression. And the other parent might have to be more exploratory, have to be more risk-taking and sort of go out into the world and do different things. Is there a relationship there?
So there is, and actually, so you're bringing up, I think, a really cool part, which is the behavioral dimorphism. But then another interesting thing that many species, whether we're talking about mammals or not, are very sexually dimorphic anatomically, right? Like obviously the peacock being one of the best examples, right? That and there's all sorts of sexual selection theory that is behind, or sort of models why you see such blatant differentiation in terms of sexual competition. But one of the interesting features, both anatomically as well as behaviorally, is that when species have evolved to become monogamous, they actually become less dimorphic anatomically. And then, as you were alluding to, for example, from the context of parental behavior, that includes behaviorally. And so one of the models that might come up with is that you're actually looking at sort of a de-differentiation from a sex different standpoint of species as they evolve to become monogamous. And one of the things that actually our work is actually showing is that doesn't seem to be the case, because when you actually start to look at or manipulate the factors that are facilitating monogamy, you actually see sort of the behaviors almost sort of collapse back to more dimorphic behaviors, so that the brain at least has evolved on top of that sort of original dimorphism to converge onto behavioral circuits, for example, for parental behavior, that even though paternal behavior and maternal behavior, obviously in the absence of, with the exception of nursing, look the same, they're actually coming at it from slightly different strategies, at least genetically and presumably neurally as well.
Interesting. And I guess that would fit with what I know to be true for humans, which is that if compared to other great apes, we tend to be more monogamous, and we're actually, even though we are sexually dimorphic anatomically and behaviorally, we are less so than, gorillas and chimps and so forth.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's true even for rodents, right? And if you look at them in the wild, that it's much more. I mean, for us, it's obviously even more difficult to tell sometimes, which is which, but that tends to be the sort of the pattern across phylogeny.
And so, we're thinking of all these interesting questions. A lot of them have to do with primates and humans. People are, naturally interested in humans because that's what we are. But of course, you can't really experimentally study humans in very much detail. It's very difficult and time consuming to do this. But there are other species that happen to be the ones that you work on where some of these questions can be tackled in a more experimentally rigorous way. So can you talk to us a little bit about the prairie voles, maybe starting with their natural history and just what we know about their behavior and some of the similarities between them and us?
Sure. So from an ecological standpoint, sort of like in the 60s and even a little bit before then, people were very interested in sort of just patterns of animal behavior and animal survival, right? And the original studies were sort of in the middle of the United States, southern Illinois, looking at just the behavior of these animals, trapping them. What is their seasonal variation? How does it vary with regards to rain, resources, things like that? And it was actually studies from Lowell Getz, who originally was trapping these animals. When I think he was a postdoc or grad student at that time, or postdoc, and noticed that in certain parts of the fields, like for certain areas of these sort of fields in southern Illinois, instead of trapping like one animal at a time or like a couple of animals at a time, he would often trap two animals at a time, and then they would be tagging them. And then if you were likely, so then he noticed that if you were trapping the same animal, you were likely to co-trap the other same animal again. And then they started to look at these pairs, and it turned out that very frequently, with a much higher frequency than other areas or other species, you would see males and females together. And so that led to this original sort of potential hypothesis that these were animals that, for at least whatever purpose, were sticking together as male-female pairs, which sort of tends to go along with monogamy. And so that was sort of the original observation that led to this being identified as a monogamous rodent species. And then very soon thereafter, thinking about the sort of now underlying endocrine and neural mechanisms, a researcher named Sue Carter sort of postulated based off of, and she's actually in interviews even said, based off her experience as a mother, one of the most profound sort of hormones that we knew was implicated in maternal bonding was this hormone oxytocin. And that's sort of what gave rise to this entire field of thinking about what is the neuroendocrine regulation of what ended up being monogamous mating strategies. But that's sort of where it first came from, these original ecological observations, long before even we knew that there were hormonal players, let alone what they might be.
And so the prairie voles, like, how do they differ from just sort of the everyday rats and mice that people might see running around outside? Are they living in big social groups underground? Are they sticking together in pairs? What is their social behavior? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think voles are actually an interesting subset of rodents that, one of the questions is why they may be so convenient from an evolutionary standpoint, that have evolved many different, like in terms of monogamy, multiple times across actually multiple geographic regions, both in the United States as well as other parts of the world. And so they, as the name suggests, prairie voles come from the prairies, where you have, again, this large distribution with resource scarcity. There are closely related montane voles. There are mountain voles, meadow voles, which are slightly different ecological territories, and they've been named. They're bank voles, and different types of geographic names for some of the species that come from Europe as well. And so one of the features seems to be that they are very, very good at rapidly differentiating, both physiologically and behaviorally into different ecological niches. And so that's been, from an evolutionary standpoint, an incredibly useful set of comparative studies, independent even of when we're thinking about behavior. And as I mentioned, so, they're basically, in the same class of rats and mice, but they tend to, depending upon their sort of social structure, prairie voles tend to have a den with, at least the litter, and usually you have sort of an adolescent generation that often is sometimes sticking around, sometimes slightly older. They have what's called alloparental care. So they'll actually care for offspring that aren't necessarily their own biologically. There's, they're probably genetic as well as behavioral components based off of who you're living with. That also,
it's like the older sibling, making you lunch when your parents are at work or something.
Exactly. And so for prairie voles, that's sort of the context that they live in. Other vole species have, sort of mouse-like social structures. Rats tend to be hyper social, even though they don't necessarily have pair bonding. And so, depending upon the sort of ecology of where these have evolved to live, they have, varied social structures.
So prairie voles out in the wild, how does the female meet the male? How do they start to form a pair bond? And walk us through what happens, through the courtship phase, through the offspring phase.
Sure. So, I think there's a little bit of looking for a mate, right? So, if you're a female, actually both males and females tend to have some sort of territorial coverage. Males often are the ones that will sort of seek out different territories, in particular if they're wandering away from the nest. And, when they encounter a female, one other interesting evolutionary correlate that I think, we haven't and others haven't looked at in depth in the wild is something called incest avoidance. And so monogamous species also tend not to mate with siblings. And I mean, that's a direction we can go in because, we've done some work to figure out, is that genetic or is it maybe not? But even in the wild, there tends to be this likelihood of not mating with a sibling. And so, if both animals are what we call sexually naive, so virgins, then it's really sort of the initial mating that seems to facilitate both the molecular and the neural mechanisms that cause this pair bond to form. It happens on slightly different timescales, at least when we look at it in the lab. Females tend to be able to form a partner preference, at least, very rapidly within 6 hours of encountering a male. Males tend to take a little bit longer, depending upon the situation of the study, maybe a day or two. And one of the things that seems to be at least important is sort of the interaction surrounding mating. And that doesn't necessarily mean like sort of successful mating and pregnancy, but rather the sort of mating attempts that stimulate the induction of hormones associated with mating. And so for females, it's estrus. These are not cycling animals. They're induced into estrus. And for males, it's presumably some of the hormones that are activated in the context of mating attempts. Potentially being one of them.
So again, things happen on different time scales, but some of this can be quite rapid. And I would presume for this species, a lot of this is mediated through olfaction. They're smelling something on the potential partner, and whether it's a hormone or a pheromone or something that can trigger some of these attachment mechanisms to get started.
So I think that may play a little bit more of a role in the identification side of things. We know, at least for females, that actually like mating attempts stimulate the induction of some of these hormones. The pheromones are part of this whole equation. They're there. We know that they definitely play a role in priming the animals to be more sexually active, which probably, like you were saying, activates the circuits, and maybe even maybe with some specificity, but also, certainly with the level of more general activation for mating. And then as the animals spend more time with each other, investigate each other, and pheromones in particulars, right? So most mammals, other than humans, use sort of two different types of smell. They use olfaction, which is what we are used to, smelling things in the air. But then there's also pheromones, which are not necessarily volatile. And so they're the direct interactions with, whether it's tears or whether it's, at the animal's bottom, there are pheromones that are specific to these regions that are male and female specific that also probably mediate, at least in large part, how they identify individuals. And so now we're getting into the sort of the neurobiology of attachment, which is how do I know that this male or this female is different from basically every other male or female? And that's the one that I'm going to attach to. And some of the work that we're actually doing is suggesting that it may not only be olfaction or chemosensation, that there might be other sensory modalities that they're using, and maybe even one sex versus the other, to identify who's my mate versus who's not.
Interesting. So I was at the dog park yesterday, and everybody knows when you get a group of dogs together, they walk around and sniff each other's butts. But what they're
Right.
actually doing there, to sort of connect this to what you're saying, is my understanding is that there's actually glands that are secreting pheromones and other things, and they need to get right there because, as you said, a lot of these things aren't volatile. So they're
Right.
basically identifying individuals by physically putting their nose against things that their nose can pick up.
Right. And these compounds, right, are actually aqueous, and they, how they're even perceived at a neural level is via sort of an aqueous medium in a different part of this general chemosensory pathway. Just in the same way, like our nose picks up volatiles, these things pick up compounds that are generally in aqueous sort of environments. So
Mm-hmm.
I think the dog analogy is exactly illustrative of what we're talking about.
And you mentioned there's sort of olfaction per se, and then there's this other nose-based sensory apparatus that has to do with pheromones. Everyone has experience with dogs. We know that some species, like mice, seem to they use their sense of smell a lot. And I know that this gets complicated and a little dicey, but in general, people characterize primates as being highly visual, and that maybe we don't use our nose, at least in quite the way that some other species do. My question is really just, before we get into the oxytocin stuff, do humans actually sense? Do humans have pheromones? Do we have that mode of perception?
So the safest answer, I think, and the answer that I think is probably true, is I think the jury's still out. There are a lot of data that suggest that we do sense sort of chemosensory compounds that are related to our biology. The question is to whether or not they're volatile versus non-volatile. So you're probably aware of, and there are these studies that are associated with like scent of sweat, right? And that how that modulates attraction, and that also, at least in some of the early studies, changes for women's with their cycle. And for men, it varies in terms of like health and things like that, how they produce some of these compounds. And so whether that response is actually coming through what is this sort of accessory olfactory system, or whether it's sort of a modification that humans have to their primary olfactory system, I think is certainly out. We know that there are these sort of, they're not anecdotal. I mean, these are studies that were done in large numbers of individuals, but I think from a sort of neurobiology system standpoint, the jury's still out in terms of whether we genuinely have what we call pheromones in most other species. And other primates, non-human primates, definitely seem to have, or certain subsets of them definitely seem to have preservation of the system that we're talking about. And so I think it's still a question of how much do we rely on those versus are they potentially there? Maybe they influence us in ways that we haven't really teased out for a lot of the reasons that you were alluding to in terms of, well, you can't do these experiments in humans. But in general, primates tend to be more visual. And I think that potentially is the analogy in terms of how we think about the sensory systems
Mm-hmm.
involved in identifying a mate versus